It's not very often in history you see a figure come along who completely reshapes and changes culture and society across an entire region. My name is Nathan Hayward, and this is my presentation on William the Conqueror. Before I get into my presentation, I'd like to give a brief overview of the topics that I will be discussing. First, we are going to be setting the stage, giving context to William the Conqueror's life, talking about his life in a biographical context from his early life, the major event in his life, the Norman Conquest, and his life as King of England until his death. Then we're going to be talking about primary sources. In particular, we're going to be talking about the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a non-Norman source. So it'll be interesting to see how it describes William the Conqueror and his kingship as a non-Norman source. Then we're going to be talking about the Domesday Books. These are a Norman source. They will provide us with where William the Conqueror's values are at as a king, how he views taxation. It's going to be very interesting looking at. And then we're going to talk about secondary sources, the contemporary arguments contemporary historians make about William the Conqueror and certain events that occurred in his life. Finally, I'm going to wrap the presentation up by talking about his connection to broader history. In particular, I'm talking about something that I'm very interested about, which is the themes of colonialism and racial supremacy, how William the Conqueror and the Norman Conquest is used to support different historical events that occur way in more modern times. So talking about his early years, William the Conqueror was born in 1028 as the illegitimate son of Robert I, the Duke of Normandy, also named Robert the Magnificent. Here's his statue in France where William the Conqueror was born. His mother was a mistress named Herleva. And despite him being labeled a bastardist son or William the Bastard in some contexts, in some instances, William's birth was actually kind of a cultural norm and was becoming even more so during his life for a high-ranking Norman to have children with mistresses or a mistress. But it was likely that if Robert I were to have another son, he would replace William as the rightful heir as the Duke of Normandy, which is important to note. But this did not happen, as in January 1035, William is formally recognized as Robert I's heir by the Norman magnates, which were high-ranking, businessmen, official people in the society, in Norman culture and society, and he was confirmed by the French King Henry I. At 8 years old, William becomes the official Duke of Normandy after the death of Robert I. He dies on his return to Normandy from his pilgrimage to the Holy Land. So there's political instability. Duke William I now is 8 years old, so he has a council of guardians to make decisions, and they're more carrying out and extending the policies of Robert I, rightfully so. William is 8 years old, but they do a poor job at ensuring any stability in the region. And even in his inner circle, William's life seems to be unsafe. And Herleva's brother hid the young William in the houses of poor people during the night to protect him. And this was likely effective and saved William the Conqueror's life, as two of his guardians would be killed. So now, as an early adult, this was a very important political time for Duke William I. He took an active role in politics in northern France through the 1040s, and this came to a climax in 1049 when negotiations were well underway for his marriage to Matilda of Flanders, the daughter of arguably the most powerful of all the great territorial princes of northern France. What's important to note is that this marriage was not approved by the Pope, something that William the Conqueror will have to pay penance for later in his career as William the Conqueror. And what's exceptionally important about this time in the 1040s is his participation in military campaigns with Edward the Confessor. In April 1051, William is informed from the Norman Archbishop of Canterbury that Edward promised him the throne as the King of England after his death. And this knowing history, this will not happen, which will lead to the Norman conquest. But it's important to see how we get to that point. So Edward paved the way as a pivotal player in Norman influence in England, as he had no heirs. So when he passed away, when he dies, the crown is vacant, leading to a very historical point in history. Historical boiling point in history. So we have the pretense for the Norman conquest. The calculated cruelty is something I want to talk about for William the Conqueror. Specifically, what I want to look at is at the Siege of Alencon, defenders of the besieged city beat furs and pelts to mock the mother of William the Conqueror, her non-noble origin. She had a very humble upbringing. She was not of nobility. She was a mistress. Her family was believed to have worked with furs and pelts in the working class. And William did not take too kindly of this. When he sieged the city, he had their hands and feet cut off. William also had an impressive stature. He was 5'9", which was tall for the time. And ultimately, Edward the Confessor is going to pass away, and he makes an apparent deathbed promise of succession to Harold in non-Norman sources, not in Norman sources, which is interesting to look at. But William, upon hearing this news of Harold's coronation, immediately sends an embassy to Rome for the Pope's approval in invading England and taking the crown. So we have here from the Bayeux Tapestry, this is a Norman source. So this event is heavily politicized, could be propaganda, but this is Harold accepting William the Conqueror's claim to the throne. He is sort of bowing to him, and William sitting above him in it looks like a position of power over Harold. So this is a heavily politicized image. It is not confirmed that this happened, but Harold is now the King of England. So we have the Norman conquest is what occurs. The Pope approves the invasion in 1066, and immediately Matilda is put in charge of Normandy alongside Roger de Beaumont and Roger de Montgomery. An invasion fleet departs in September of 1066, arriving in Pevensey before dawn, where they will meet with Harold's army. So these armies meet as pretty much equals. We know this from how long the battle is drawn out to, which was exceptionally long for the time. The armies of Harold and William were equivalent in size at approximately 7,000. Could be more, in the battle lasted all day, through a night, and through a night. There were pauses in the battle, but this battle went on for a good amount of time. William's troops were at a disadvantage, and they had to fight up a steep incline. And Harold was also at his own disadvantage, one not having many archers to keep keep William's troops at bay. He also had his maneuverability inhibited by a forest that was surrounding his army. So as discussed before, William utilized a very mobile cavalry. He had this particular strategy of faking retreats and then keeping this super mobile force that could then fight back. And he did this numerous times in the battle. And Harold lacked these archers to keep this cavalry at distance, leading to his eventual death. He's killed later in the day, and this would debilitate his army, decisively ending the battle in Norman victory. And here we have another image from the Bayeux Tapestry of Harold's death. It is said from this image that he was shot through the eye with an arrow, but here is him depicted in the numerous stages of death, falling to the ground and effectively ending the Battle of Hastings. So the Norman conquest continued. This was not it. This did not immediately make William the King of England. He needed to secure his legitimacy if he wanted to be crowned the King of England. So in doing so, he marches to London. This is a quote here. The ships which had brought the Norman army to England were now needed to bring yet more soldiers from Normandy, and the invaders, we must assume, having for a while no navy at their disposal, were compelled to seize the seaports from the land. So this is talking about William the Conqueror's need for more men and to secure a supply chain across the channel by securing the seaport. Because if he were to, this is an amphibious invasion from Normandy to England, he will need to have a base of supplies and more men and a secure route for these items that will help him to get across the channel. And this will ultimately be successful, controlling these seaports. He will, on Christmas Day at Westminster Abbey, be crowned the King of England, King William I of England. The event, a very interesting fact about this event, it was so overly secured that the sound of shouts and affirmations from within the abbey frightened the guards so much that they burned nearby buildings out of fear of rebellion, even though the sounds that they heard came from within the event that they were guarding, which was interesting. So now managing the kingdom was an entirely different struggle. William, throughout his entire reign as king, was in multiple places, going around from different region to different region, suppressing rebellion against his rule. And so he had this tactic, another cruel tactic called harrying the North. It was effectively making the northern England uninhabitable temporarily to prevent even the chance that it was used to aid a rebellion force. So he did all of this in England. Um, but in his later years, this is especially true. He spent about 4/5 of his life in Normandy and France rather than England. He attempted to learn the language, but gave up. So he's spending a significant amount of his time in Normandy and France, spending time in England suppressing rebellion. He is constantly traveling, pretty much as King of England. But within his own family, there is conflict specifically with his eldest son, Robert, who was irritated in William's reluctance to give him a position of authority. After William's death, he will be the Duke of Normandy. But at this point, Robert is upset with his reluctance to have any power in the government or in this kingdom. So Robert was promised the English throne as the successor of William I, 1063, as his eldest heir. But Robert attempted to capture the castle of Rouen, but failed and fled to Normandy, which will create issues down the road with succession after William the Conqueror's death. We will talk about that later. We're going to talk about the final years leading up to his death of William the Conqueror. The death of Matilda was an exceptionally serious blow to William for two different reasons. The first reason being that all historical sources suggest that he loved her very much. He was very faithful to her, which was extremely unusual for kings of this time. And also on a political scale, she governed in the absence of William and held the royal kindred together. As I mentioned before, William's constantly moving around the kingdom, and Matilda was a huge source of stability in the kingdom, in the kinship, in the kindred. And so what would come next is the death of William the Conqueror. And on September 9th, 1087, he passes away surrounded by a clergy and magnates, and he leaves the throne to William Rufus, which will be debated, as one of our secondary sources will talk about. So he is, at this point in his life, overweight. He is ill, and he is moved out from the city to pass away. It's clear that he is going to die. And so he is buried at Abbey Church, in which he founded as a part of his penance. It is where God permitted him to conquer England. And this is the site of his burial in modern-day Caen, France. So now we're going to get into our primary sources, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the Domesday Books. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, here is a sample page to show what the source looked like. So what is it? It is the Chronicle of England over many centuries from the perspective of the Anglo-Saxons, which those are who is being conquered in the Norman conquest. So it is not likely that we'll see favorable biases towards the Normans. It'll likely be against them. So it's going to be interesting looking at how William is perceived in this chronicle. So in general, going back in history, it likely began as a part of the education reforms of the later 9th century made by Alfred the Great. So what does it say about King William I? So what I thought was interesting, what I pulled out from the source, was William wore his crown 3 times a year when in England, exercising his divine authority on Easter, Pentecost, and Christmas, all holy days. So what I took this as is he's exercising his divine authority over the land. On Easter, the resurrection of Christ, Pentecost, the descent of the Holy Spirit, and Christmas, the birth of Christ. On these days, he would be accompanied by all of his archbishops, the clergy. It would be a large religious demonstration in England, sort of showing his divine authority over the land, that he is God's chosen ruler, pretty much. Also goes on by saying he's a very stern and wrathful king. He arrested earls who disobeyed his rule and even removed church officials, showing that he had absolute authority. William was one who would not take challenge within the political system, arresting earls, high-ranking members of society, and even removing church officials, which I thought was incredibly interesting. The source also notes that if he lived slightly longer, it is certain that he would have conquered Ireland, and without much of a fight either. this could mean two things. He had a lot of military power towards the end of his life, and also political power towards the end of his life. He had enough power to easily take down another or easily conquer and add a significant portion of land to his kingdom. However, he did pass away, and that is just speculation inside of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Amongst other things, this is a quote. Amongst other things, the good order that William established is not to be forgotten. It was such that any man might travel over the kingdom with a bosom full of gold unmolested, and no man durst kill another, however great the injury he might have received from him. What does this quote mean? So the meaning that I got from this quote was that the under William the First, it was incredibly stable, and the legal system was enforced very harshly and very effectively. It says here you can walk across the kingdom with gold in your possession and not be mugged and have it stolen from you. No man will kill another, no matter how great the harm received from him is. It looks like law in Norman England was enforced to the highest level, and it seems like legally a very stable time from the quote from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The next source I want to talk about is the Domesday Books. This will get us the idea of where his priorities were at as king of England. This will take place in his later years, his much later years, as he's older, in his 50s. Land survey. So what were they? They were land surveys ordered by King William I on Christmas Day in 1085. And these surveyors would go around and ask who owns the land, who owned it during King Edward, how large is the land, how much is it worth. We're looking through the entire history of the land pretty much as the surveyors. And so there are these surveys are comprised in two books. The first book is the Great Domesday Book, which is the large majority of the survey, and then the Little Domesday Book, which is the inclusion of multiple counties: Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk. So these documents were so important because they assisted William in issuing taxation and giving land and money to French nobles when the conquest. When the Norman conquest was successful in gaining land acquisitions, there were French nobles, French high-ranking individuals moving into new territory, and this gave William a picture on how, for their loyalty and support, to reward these people with available land. As well as land that was already existent in high-ranking landholders in Anglo-Saxon society. There were how we can tax the land and how the kingship can make money off the land, and how it will ultimately add to his worth, his greed as King of England. So a lot of it is important to note that not every bit of land was surveyed in these land surveys in 1085. London was not included as a massive, or as an urban center, was not included. And there was detriment to not being included in these because it made the legal system much easier to settle land disputes. You had the history of land documented, and so you could very efficiently settle disputes between individuals concerning land. You had all the history there: who owned it, at what point. But if you were not in there, it would make it much difficult to make your case legally, and it would not be to your benefit not being included in these surveys. So in general, we're going to look at an excerpt of one of these pages of the Domesday Book. This passage has to do with Nettleham, a settlement in the county of Lincolnshire. So this is the Lincolnshire section of the Great Domesday Book. This is page 5. So let's look at what this says. This is what it looked like. It was a description of land holdings in a list format. And so it was described as having 28 villager households, 1 freeman, and 12 smallholders. Here we have a class. We have classes defined in the society. Smallholders were people who held small jobs, smallholders, fishermen, stuff like that. More like a feudal peasant class, sort of. So there were 16 plow lands, 3 royal plow teams, and 11 men's plow teams. So this is the capabilities of this land and being financially beneficial to the king, how efficient you can yield from from these plow lands, how much money you can make from them practically. So at this point in 1066, when Edward the Confessor is in charge, this land was expected to pay 24 pounds annually. And in 1086, when the survey is conducted and William I is in charge, it is 30 pounds annually. The land in 1066 belonged to Queen Edith, which was the wife of Edward the Confessor, and King William in 1086. So now we're going to talk about secondary sources and contemporary historical arguments. What arguments historians are making about the life of life of William the Conqueror and the events that surrounded him. So, what is being argued in this first source, the De Abitu Wilhelmi, which means the death of William in Latin. This concerns William's last words and his plans for succession. The work contains it legitimizes William the Rufus's claim to the throne. However, looking deeper into this source in the Catherine Lack's thesis is that this source has inconsistencies to it, that it could have been used as political propaganda, very early political propaganda to aid William Rufus's legitimacy. So let's start here. The work contains copied portions from other works, the Vita Caroli Magni and Oderic Vitalis, which is Oderic Vitalis is a person, copied copied significantly for certain excerpts, and one phrase which was rearranged in the source, talking about William wanting to give the power to his prodigal son, which was Robert. So this sentence was rearranged, which is suspicious, but also the overall construction of the source was written down very hastily. And if we know about William the Rufus, he took the throne very hastily. Before his father had even passed away, he was making arrangements to become the next king. Another interesting thing to note is 2/3 of this entire source are talking about William's reluctance to name Robert Curthose the Duke of Normandy. It plays a significant portion. A significant portion is talking about William's mistrust in his son, legitimizing William Rufus's eventual claim to the throne. As I mentioned before, William Rufus quickly travels to England to beat Robert Curthose. He is successful. He wins, or he gets the crown and is coronated as King of England. And it is clear that he's a controversial king, so to legitimize his right to the throne, would he propagandize his father's death? It's very interesting. Very interesting looking and reading that source. So the next source, the final source here from a contemporary historian, is the Imagining the Conquering, the changing image of William the Conqueror. So this is very interesting. This will tie into part 3, the final, the ending segment of my presentation. Where we're talking about how William the Conqueror and the Norman Conquest is used and changed and manipulated to fit different societal times. And we're going to discuss what that means pretty much. The biographies of William the Conqueror directly reflect the ideas of the society of the biographer. It starts first off with 1830s French historians. Although it first starts off criticizing William's use of absolute power. Although King William improved France to 1066, he exercised despotism to do so, acting as a belligerent despot. But then it talks about the clash between Normans and Anglo-Saxons was barbarism against civilization. So the idea that the Anglo-Saxons were drunks and uncivilized, which we know historically is not the case, but to fit the concept of colonialism, which France is engaging in at this time, they're going to treat the Norman conquest like it was bringing civility to England from France, or from Normandy, northern France. So the Norman conquest was compared in these sources to the expedition of Algiers, which is France in Algeria, which was an example of colonialism. So here's a solid evidence used to solidify and legitimize colonialism, that we are in these areas of the world oppressing people for the greater good of society. We're expanding civilization. These people were uncivilized, barbaric before they got there, before the Normans arrived, and we are doing them a favor and advancing humanity by being present in that region. Here's a quote from the source. William, in other words, was a master of a technique of social and political organization regarding which the English were only beginners. So the English were on their way to becoming a civilized society, but they were nowhere near the mastery that William the Conqueror was when he invaded in the Norman conquest. So William here is understood through the imperialist and nationalistic lens. So the way 1930 Norman historians talk about it's the same, but there's a racialized aspect of it as well. So it's the same thesis here. The biographies of William the Conqueror directly reflect the ideals of the society of the biographer, but we're talking about almost a century later in the 1930s. So there's a quasi-racial view that located Norman talents in the blood, that what William the Conqueror did was just what Norman people are capable of, that this is our national identity, this is our racial identity. So it ties Hastings to the World War I Battle of Verdun. So tying the Norman conquest multiple centuries prior to a contemporary event, these soldiers were the sons of those at Hastings. So it's the nation state idea that your ethnicity is aligned with the state. You were Norman, meaning that you were the son of the warriors who won at the Battle of Hastings. That victory was guaranteed for you. That you were that it is in your blood that you are going to succeed once again. So this even ties into World War II themes of the fatherland, that this land that we're fighting for, expansionism, is owed to us as the Norman conquest, gaining that territory, this land that we are fighting for is rightfully ours as victory runs in our blood, as they say. So William, in this context, is understood through a racialized lens and a bit of myth history, which is misinterpreting history to fit to argue for historical events like colonialism and expansionism. So what does the case study of William the Conqueror tell us about the wider context of history? So I'm going to talking a lot about what I had talked about on the previous slide. First, we need to talk about the concept of winner's history. Historians now do an incredible job at giving a corroborated, full, critically analyzed version of history where we're talking about the oppressed, the losers, the winners. But earlier in history, we have this idea of winner's history, that we only pay attention to the winners in every scenario, and the sources and the firsthand accounts of the losers is completely disregarded. And this is how a lot of textbooks were crafted. But this is largely not the case anymore. If you look deeper, there's a great surplus of sources talking about, like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, talking about what the Anglo-Saxon experience was like, the Lament of Rygefark, what that experience was like being occupied by the Normans. So like I said, historians do an incredible job right now critically analyzing and corroborating sources to see what actually happened, looking back on these historical events. And when we don't cross-analyze and corroborate sources, we can use the Norman conquest to justify imperialism and other negative aspects of history, like we talked about before. So I'm going to talk about the late 1930s and 1940s here. William the Conqueror is used once again to defend the an idea of racial heritage, the myth of destiny, that we're going to win because it is in our blood. Hitler and the Nazi Party were particularly interested with the Normans and William the Conqueror as a military strategy case study, interestingly enough, because in the summer of 1940, Hitler was looking, after conquering France and splitting France into two, Vichy France and Nazi-occupied France, they were looking to launch an amphibious invasion of England. And this invasion was ultimately a failure. It did not work out the way they wanted to, and that would lead to them having to go into Operation Barbarossa, which would be in the USSR, which many, many years later will be the collapse of Germany on that Eastern Front. But looking towards Britain, they're looking for military strategy out of the case study of William the Conqueror, which I think is incredibly interesting, looking that far back in history. But also, the Nazis are looking for the racialized aspect. They had the Bayeux Tapestry that was in their possession as well, looking at the Normans to study the idea of a master race. And so also with imperialism, I have pictured here King Leopold II of Belgium. He was an imperialist who invaded and colonized a large part of the Congo, and he is responsible for a genocide in Rwanda that occurred over 100 years after his death. So the effects of colonialism and the use of the Norman conquest and other historical events to defend racialized myth history has been a problem. But through the critical analyzation of sources that historians engage in nowadays, it is becoming more readily available to have complete histories of these events, like the Norman conquest and numerous other battles throughout history. That is my presentation. Thank you very much. And this is my bibliography. Thank you for listening.